The true strength of India is found in 125,000 beating hearts in this stadium, and the millions and millions of people who have seen and witnessed our great friendship and admiration today.
That was President Trump speaking earlier today to over 100,000 people at a rally in Indian Prime Minister Modi's hometown. The president and First Lady Melania Trump arrived in India today, the world's largest democracy, for a two-day state visit branded Namaste Trump. Prime Minister Modi and President Trump are expected to announce new agreements on the purchase of U.S. military equipment and possible energy cooperation against the backdrop of China's growing influence. Prior to the trip, the Trump administration officials said that the president is also expected to address alleged human rights abuses in Kashmir and relay concerns about the treatment of religious minorities in India. This is President Trump's first visit to India as president and the fourth consecutive U.S. president to visit the country. Joining us now in New Delhi, India, White House reporter for the Associated Press, Jonathan Lemire. Jonathan, what more can we expect from this visit, and what is he hoping exactly to accomplish?
Hi, Mika. This trip is going to be a lot more style than substance and pageantry over policy. The president and the first lady right now are en route to the Taj Mahal. They will be giving a private tour of the Taj Mahal, the famous wonder of the world, within the next half hour or so. As you said, he arrived earlier today. There were throngs of people lining the street. He was treated to traditional dancers and musicians. In the Prime Minister Modi's hometown, he stopped by Mahatma Gandhi's humble ashram earlier today, seeing the site for Gandhi, and then he went on to the stadium where over 100,000 people were packed in. He gave a speech, emphasized the U.S. friendship with India. Modi reiterated that praise. The two men have a tight bond, and there'll be more meetings again tomorrow. But there's not expected to be much. The arms sales, as you said, yes. Also, some work towards a trade deal. There's actually been some tension on the trade side between India and the United States, but there's not expected to be a real breakthrough here. This is more about sort of re-emphasizing the friendship between the two nations and also giving this president, campaign commercial-ready B-roll. Certainly it's a good look for any White House to have a president on the world stage, particularly when you can contrast that against the Democrats back home campaigning.
Who, of course, can't even count votes in their early elections. Nevada, just like Iowa, it's unbelievable. Jonathan, though, talk about the relationship, the positive relationship between the two leaders of the two largest democracies in the world. Both, I won't quite say strong men, but two leaders who have strong man instincts. And again, like I said, the two largest democracies in the world. These two get along fairly well, don't they?
They do, Joe. You're right. They both have some strongman tendencies, if nothing else. This is sort of the back half of a home and home, if you will. The president hosted Modi to a rally in Texas and Houston in the fall that was called Howdy Modi, and over 50,000, mostly Indian Americans, packed the stadium there. Even bigger crowd today, and it is the world's largest cricket stadium and one of the largest stadiums, period, in the world. The two men do get along. Modi's a noted hugger. The president's not that into physical contact, but he does allow Modi to hug him from time to time. And they do share sort of a same populist streak. And there's a connection there as well. Now, Modi's having a little bit of a tough time here in India. The economy has really stalled. There's here in Delhi, there's a lot of construction projects that sort of stopped halfway through because the financing has run out. But there's, as much as there is some trade tension, there is an alliance here that's needed to sort of attempt to slow down the rise of China right here in the neighborhood. And, the president has offered to perhaps even broker some peace talks between India and their ancient rivals, Pakistan, although it's not clear anyone's going to take him up on that. And yes, as you alluded to in the opening, as Mika did, there are some human rights concerns here. The treatment of Muslims, in particular in India, it's not sure, though, whether the president will address them publicly or not. That's not usually his style when he's overseas. He sometimes will bring them up privately, but unlike other presidents who have used the spotlight of these foreign trips to sort of promote American values on the world stage. This president doesn't seem to do that, at least not publicly.
Well, of course, also many people said that perhaps this was for the president to help promote his struggling brand, business brand. Outside of the United States, Trump has more properties, more condominiums, more skyscrapers in India than any other place in the world. And you were talking about the economy that was really dragged down in India right now. Certainly, Donald Trump and the Trump organization are acutely feeling that pinch, with a lot of their buildings unoccupied right now in India.
That's true, Joe. There's a development. There's none here in Delhi, but there's one in Mumbai. There's some other projects in the western part of India that have really stalled, and that just before he took office, the Trump organization struck a deal to license the Trump name on these buildings. It was seen as it would be a boon here in India, but these buildings are largely sitting empty right now because the economy here has slowed down so dramatically. Now, tomorrow the president will be here in Delhi. He's got a few meetings with Modi. He's going to be also treated to a state dinner, which has also raised an interesting question. What is the president going to eat? Modi is a noted vegetarian. He promotes vegetarianism every chance he gets. Of course, the president is known for his love of hamburgers and steak. Cows, sacred here in India. They're not served. That's not going to be on the menu. So that's going to be a question, whether the president is willing to try some local delicacies during the state dinner, or whether the Secret Service and White House officials have imported some of his own favorite meals back from the White House.
All right, Jonathan Lemire, namaste. Thank you
The
very
world
much.
waits with bated breath
Yes, it
on whether a
does.
Big Mac
What's
is
he gonna
smuggled
eat?
in the back of the Taj Mahal.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.